And the time is now 6:06. Is there anyone that wishes to address the commission on an item that is not on the agenda? We are limited to what is on the agenda for tonight. Wants a future item? No? All right.
Chair Buss, if I may, I apologize for interrupting. Brittany, if you would be so kind as to allow me to share my screen, I have a PowerPoint for the meeting, the various agendas or agenda items.
Should I do a roll call while you're doing that, John?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay. Let's move on with that. Commissioner Ball, I see, is present.
Here.
Commissioner Bill. All right, I believe he's absent. Commissioner Garrity is here, I believe.
Here.
All right, and I see Commissioner Garrison is here.
Here.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Gilbert, I believe, is not present today, right?
Is correct. That is correct.
Okay. And Commissioner Larson?
Yep, I'm here.
All right. Commissioner Montero?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, thank you. And Commissioner Nucci?
Here.
All right, thank you. All right. Did you want to go, John, or do you want me to do move on to approval of the meeting minutes?
Well, at least on my screen, it says I'm sharing my screen. I don't know if everyone else can see the slide that says agenda item 2.
Yes, perfect.
Oh, good, okay.
Yeah, we'll move on to agenda item number 2, approval of the January 13th, 2021 meeting minutes. Is there anyone that has any corrections or additions to it?
Yes, this is Commissioner Garrity. On page 2, the first paragraph, it's like the last 2 lines. It says, I guess I was a little confused. There's a line that says, as for the legation treatment is concerned, there has been coordination between Mr. Southard and Mr. Garrity. And I'm not sure what that means. It makes it sound like, John and I were colluding something devious or something like that. So I wasn't sure if that needs to be corrected or maybe removed.
John, did you have?
That's all I have.
Commissioner Ball here. I have a few spell check items. I think many of our computers are looking at the word electoral these days because it's in social media and it's meant to be electrical. So I will simply email those to you guys, but it's just spell check items.
And I had one thing. I think Andy Darling's name was misspelled as Andrew Darwin. But that's it.
All right. Any others? All right. Would someone like to make a motion to approve the January 13th meeting minutes with the corrections that were just noted by the 3 commissioners?
I'll move to accept the meeting minutes with a few spell check corrections as noted.
All right.
Second, Garrison.
Thank you, Commissioner Garrison. All in favor? We'll start with Commissioner Ball.
Aye.
Thank you. Commissioner Garrity?
Aye.
Commissioner Garrison?
Aye.
Commissioner Larson?
Aye.
Thank you. Commissioner Montero?
Aye.
Commissioner Nucci?
Aye.
And Chair Buss is an aye as well. All right, thank you. And we will move on to agenda item number 3, a discussion and consideration of representation from the 4 Southern tribes. And what can you tell us about that, John? Are you there, John? Brittany, have we lost John?
No, he's here and he's
No, I'm-
unmuted.
Yeah, I should be. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Yes, agenda item 3, and there we are. Discuss and consider 4 Southern Tribes representation on Historic Preservation Commission. The commissioners will likely recall that in 2019, there was discussion of including a representative from the 4 Southern Tribes, those being Okjen Indian Community, Gila River Indian Community, Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, and Tono Atum Indian Community, ensuring representation of the 4 Southern Tribes on the Historic Preservation Commission. This would have to occur via an ordinance revision. In 2019, the commission, by consensus, recommended that action be taken. There have been subsequent discussions, and it is now before the commission to, should they so choose, take formal action, that is a formal motion memorializing that recommendation that was made by consensus in 2019.
All right, thanks, John. Would someone like to start discussion on the item?
Yes, I had a question. This is Commissioner Ball, Vice Chair Ball. In July 10th, 2019, on page 2 of the meeting minutes, it looks like we were in discussion on whether or not this would be an advisory position or a voting position. In that, I understand that we've got to make a change to the ordinance or recommend to council that they make a change to the ordinance to allow that. And my question is that a change to the ordinance because of the potential for candidates representing the 4 Southern Tribes to not be residents of Tempe, or is that required simply as a new member of the commission in advisory position or in voting position? I certainly understand that if we wish to have a voting position, that there would have to be a change of ordinance. Would the same be true if it were an advisory condition?
So Chair Buss, Vice Chair Ball, an ordinance change would be required for a few reasons. First, at the moment, all members of the Historic Preservation Commission must be Tempe residents. So that would need to be changed. There are specifications as to representation of professions. So this would presumably be included in that group, thus ensuring representation of the 4 Southern Tribes. Ultimately, the matter of advisory versus voting member would be up to council. The advisory member, that is the representative from the Tempe History Museum, that is included in the ordinance. So yes, in either sense, it would be included, need to be included in a revision. I believe the discussions with the 4 Southern Tribes, preliminary discussions, there seems to be a preference to have a voting member, that is equal representation.
Okay. Was there further discussion with the tribes as to how many members would be requested? If we add 1 member, for instance, that would place us at an even number. Or as we rotate out, would we remain at 9?
Vice Chair Ball,
Yes.
this is Alex. We had talked about that, and I think it would be the latter. We'd probably work to, based on your recommendation and council's consideration, if we did put an ordinance forward, it would likely institute a 4 Southern Tribes member immediately, and we would be at 10 for a while. But then when the next member termed out, they would not, that position wouldn't be filled.
Okay.
Dr. Smith, when is the next commissioner that terms out?
I defer to Mr. Southard on that one. He keeps track of me.
Maybe myself in 1 year, but
Yeah, I was going to say, I believe, Chair Buss, you may well be. I don't have it up in front of me. The reason being, I'm trying to.
I have that answer.
I'm sorry, Brittany?
I have that answer.
Oh, perfect.
It's Chair Bus on March 31st, 2021. And then we also have Gregory Larson, March 30th. Well, no, sorry. He got another term. That one, he's the only one. Just Chair Bus is the only one that turns out next.
oh, okay. I thought mine was 2022. You're saying it's 2021.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's what I have on here. I'll have to double check with the clerk's office because they haven't said anything. But yeah, that's what I have on here.
Okay. I thought it was 22, but it could look fast. But I guess I'll get us back on track here. Commissioner Montero, did you have a comment on this?
Well, yeah, I think when we talked about this a while back, we totally agreed that this was a great thing to do, and I'm very much in favor of it. Obviously, the Otham and the Pipash have been here before Tempe was here, and I think this is a really good move. So I would like to make a motion. I move that our commission, the Historic Preservation Commission, direct the Historic Preservation Office to transmit to City Council a recommendation that the Historic Preservation Ordinance be revised to include a reserved seat for a representative of the 4 Southern Tribes.
All right, thank you.
I'll second that motion. This is Nucci.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Nucci. And all in favor, Commissioner Ball? Commissioner Ball, how do you vote?
Sorry about that. I had muted myself.
Okay,
Aye.
you're an aye. Okay. Commissioner Garrity,
Aye.
Commissioner Garrison,
Aye.
thank you. Commissioner Larson.
Aye.
All right, Commissioner Montero, oh, you made the motion, so that's an aye. And Commissioner
Aye.
Nucci seconded, and I will join the ayes, make it unanimous. I think it's an excellent idea.
And so, Chair Buss, just to clarify, the desire of the commission is that the 4 Southern Tribes representative would be, the seat would ensure 4 Southern Tribes representation, but the representative would be presumably selected by the 4 Southern Tribes?
I would assume so. Well, I guess all commissioners are approved by the mayor of Tempe.
Well, they're absolutely, and that would need to occur. I suppose, is it a representative that will be designated and then, with the advice of and consent of mayor and council, appointed to the commission?
I believe so. I think that's how all commissioners are put on. The commission is, you submit an application and the mayor considers who he would like to have as on the commission. I guess that means the mayor would be deciding if there was multiple applicants from the 4 Southern Tribes, which one he would like to pick.
So I suppose it may be helpful as I transmit this recommendation, if there could be a supplementary motion to clarify,
Right.
if it is the wish of the HPC that the 4 Southern Tribes would identify a candidate who would then be considered by the mayor and council for appointment. That would, I believe, streamline the the process and avoid questions that may arise.
Brian?
Yep. I would move that we request that the 4 Southern tribes put forth a candidate for the mayor to approve.
I second that. Ms. Nucci.
Thank you, Commissioners Ball and Nucci, for the motion and the second. And once again, how do you vote, Commissioner Ball?
Aye.
Commissioner Garrity?
Aye.
All right, Commissioner Garrison?
Aye.
Commissioner Larson?
Aye.
And Commissioner Montero?
Aye.
All right, Commissioner Nucci is obviously an aye, and I will be an aye as well. All right.
And Chair Buss, before we move on to the next agenda item, I do want to note that Councilmember Kuby is in attendance, and she has added a link to the chat box. She has confirmed that you do not term out until 2022, so we have you for another year.
Well, thank you, Member Kuby, for clarifying that. I thought it was 2022, and I enjoy my work, so I hope to be around for another year. All right, we will move on to agenda item number 4, streetcar signage. And what can you tell us about that, John?
Thank you, Chair Buss. Yes, this one is very exciting. As the Commission will likely recall, we've had several discussions with representatives of the Tempe History Museum and the streetcar team regarding signage that is to be erected at the various streetcar stops. This is not unlike the signage project that was completed for the light rail stops. And please excuse this as the presentation lags behind as I speak. But there are to be numerous streetcar stops, the gray dots here on the blue line. Initially, the plan was to have signs at each location that would include photographs from various points and locations in Tempe history with explanations of what is depicted there. Here is an example from the light rail, and I do apologize for the speed at which this is progressing. Here's an example of the signage for the light rail, and the Commission has seen from the streetcar team a draft of the signage format for the streetcar stops. There was discussion on the part of the Commission, the fact that these signs represented or spoke to history dating 1871 to the present and excluded Tempe's very rich prehistory. In working with the streetcar team, the Tempe History Museum, and others, we were able to obtain one of the locations that had been slated for a Tempe history sign for use by the 4 Southern tribes, that location being the southeast corner of Mill Avenue and Rio Salado Parkway. So right at the base of the butte, which is a phenomenal location given the nature of the signage. Then the question became, how exactly do we go about producing such a sign? And as it happens, as a result of the South Mountain Freeway project, funding had been made available to the Gila River Indian community, and they had employed Dr. Andy Darling of Southwest Heritage Research to draft a series of signs for the various landforms throughout the valley. So after speaking with representatives of the 4 Southern tribes and Dr. Darling, we were fortunate enough to be just the second signage location for this project. I have a draft of the sign here, and at this point we'll turn it over to Dr. Darling.
Thanks, John. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. It's a pleasure to be here, and this is the first time I've spoken to the commission before, so it's good to see some familiar faces and new faces as well. And Chairman, I'll do a brief summary of the sign that we've designed. As John mentioned, this is the second sign in a series of signs that are being developed as a result of efforts for the South Mountain Freeway Traditional Cultural Properties Study. And in communication with the Gila River Indian community, particularly Tipo Barnaby Lewis, he expressed an interest in trying to do something that was useful for increasing awareness publicly and in the sort of greater metropolitan area of the presence of the O'odham and the Peeposh, extending back to, as he would say, time immemorial, and in ways that would be accessible, so that this awareness would be something that people would, gradually become more familiar and comfortable with, and recognizing the very deep prehistoric Native American roots of the region, and also identifying places that people could go and see some of these things. Since one of the issues that we often have to deal with, especially as archaeologists and particularly on reservations, is people find out about places, they want to go see them, but they may not be public parks or public facilities, and can lead to damage to sites that really are not publicly accessible. So we came up with this idea of creating a series of signs that would be placed that would identify particularly topographic features. We really didn't want to identify archaeological sites or sensitive areas, but that had existing traditional place names. And the first sign, which is kind of the prototype sign, which we worked with Pueblo Grande Museum and Lorene Montero in particular, Commissioner Montero, on developing, was for Iron Mountain, better known as Piestewa Peak, and the name for that place is Vinum Doak in the O'odham language. And this was in part as a way of balancing out information on the naming of Piestewa Peak, the renaming of it, and also to acknowledge that even before Piestewa Peak and its earlier name, that there existed this name Vinum Doak, and that it had a connection with O'odham traditions. So this became our initial prototype sign, and the sign would have some aspect of the place that it's describing, but would be situated in a landscape known as the O'odham Jeward or O'odham homeland. And so while the O'odham homeland is much bigger than the metropolitan area, we really are focusing on the metropolitan area for places where we'd want to have signs. So each sign would include this master map that has the traditional O'odham names for places on them, a few features that would be recognizable to people so they can figure out where they are, and then places are identified that are accessible to the public as well. So if they want to go see Vinum Doak, for instance, they can go to the park at Piestewa Peak and visit that place directly. In the same way, yeah.
Andy, sorry to interrupt, but Brittany, I'm unable to share my screen. I have a higher resolution, I think, that would be helpful while Andy was talking.
Give me a second.
You did such good work, Andy. I can't have it be so small.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know if people could zoom in on that or not.
Here we go.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, so you can see this particular map is for Tempe Butte, which is in the O'odham language is Oidabat Doak. And the design of this map also, we worked with a designer who we were able to identify through Pueblo Grande Museum, a guy named Stephen Reichert, who's worked on exhibits there. And he's done a fabulous job both with the map design as well as the artwork. So he's got a very good sort of graphic sense, and so he was able to help us design this map. And as you can see in this particular map, the highlighted spot, the blue dot, the large one is Oidabat Doak or Tempe Butte. And each of these different topographic features has a name, and in time we'd hope that we would be able to develop signs for each of those areas or those locations. We're also looking at multiple signs within South Mountain Park and Preserve, and again, these are different jurisdictions, obviously. So we'd be working with City of Phoenix and City of Scottsdale or those municipalities that actually want to have signs. Now, what ADOT's been willing to fund the community to do is develop the designs, and then in some instances, like within the South Mountain Park and Preserve, where it borders the community, assist with actual production and installation. Whereas in other cases, we can provide the design, and then if it works with existing projects to put in public signage, then the design is provided through the Gila River Indian community. The other kind of nice aspect about this outreach project for the South Mountain Freeway effort is that the work is essentially being produced through the Gila River Indian community. So before it actually goes out to others to look at, we've gone through and really vetted the design through the Tribal Historic Preservation Office at Gila River, and worked with them and other community members to find out what elements of the sign that they would want to have in there. In the case of Oidabat Doak, the information that we provide includes a traditional song. This is a song that's never been published before, to my knowledge, in the it's in the Bluebird series of traditional songs. And we worked on the translation for that, so it would also be accessible to the public, but would also be true to the song itself, so that community members from the 4 Southern tribes who see the English translation of the song would appreciate and probably know which song that's talking about. Tempe Butte is different because it's actually got quite a few songs associated with it, and some songs are songs that are available in the academic literature, but aren't appropriate to share with the general public, partly because of their use in funerals. So this was something that we had to coordinate with Salt River and Gila River to make sure we found a song that was accessible and attractive, but at the same time wasn't culturally sensitive. And we worked a lot with Shane Antone and with Barnaby Lewis and their staff to find an appropriate song. This particular song is actually a really beautiful one and presents a really nice image about Tempe Butte. The other aspect of it, Oidabat Doak, it means Deadfield Mountain. So Deadfield Mountain probably refers to the agricultural systems and fields that once existed prehistorically or in the historic period around the base of Tempe Butte. So it opens up themes about the Salt River irrigation systems that allow us to talk about the prehistory of the area, and also the rock art for which Tempe Butte is very well known. And there's at least 500 petroglyphs or groups of petroglyphs up on that on Tempe Butte. So we're able to talk a little bit about that. The other interesting content of the sign is Tempe Butte has been memorialized in O'odham historical traditions as a place where an historic battle occurred in the I think it was 1835 is one of the references, but in the middle 19th century anyway, in which several enemy raiders, possibly Apache, maybe Yavapai, head down to the Gila River area to wrestle cattle, and then they're caught up, they're discovered and chased back to Tempe Butte, where they climb up the butte and hold out, but only to be surrounded by O'odham warriors and eventually dispatched, with one escaping to tell the tale. But
so, Dr. Darling?
Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt. I apologize. I believe the draft that is being shown is an earlier version. So, Brittany, if we could switch, I have the PDF of the most recent.
Yeah, Oidabat is misspelled at the top. We don't want.
Yeah. So let me share here. You could go on talking. Okay. I will share.
Yeah. So the story goes that after the enemy are chased to the top of the hill, they're surrounded and on all sides and eventually killed. with one individual escaping across the river to the north. And but what's interesting about this particular history is it's memorialized not in the name Odabat Doak or Deadfield Mountain, but it is memorialized in the Peeposh name for the mountain, which is where is it? It's I'm going to try this Gwanyakul, which means where the enemy climbed up. And what's interesting about that name is it also happens to be the Peeposh traditional name for the city of Tempe. So we have kind of an interesting layer of information there for the public to be reading the sign and find out what the Peeposh name for the city of Tempe is, and how it's remembered as the place where the enemy climbed up. So this is a kind of a really fairly rich, multi-layered sign. Some of the images in the sign, the historical event involving the destruction or killing of the enemies is recorded in multiple calendar sticks, the traditional calendar sticks of the autumn. So we get to introduce that particular bit of information and a picture of a traditional calendar stick. And also in the images, we are able to depict a western bluebird as the representative of the kahagam or autumn bluebird. The western bluebird, actually, we're not sure if it's a kahagam is really a western bluebird. There's other bluebird candidates out there, but he seems to be the western bluebird seems to be the best candidate. But I think Stephen, with his design, he thought it'd be artful to depict one of the petroglyphs as sort of the bird singing a petroglyph at the bottom, as well as the historic image of Tempe Butte from 1900. So this kind of opens up a whole series of different layers about the mountain that people wouldn't recognize. That it has two traditional names, Odabat Doak being the autumn name, song traditions that are associated with it, historical events that are remembered in the oral traditions of both the Peeposh and the Yakimut Autumn, and then finally these the many petroglyphs that are present there. And with those petroglyphs, we kind of conclude the text of the sign by recognizing that petroglyphs and rock art are sacred, and that these do need to be protected, and that vandalism is not only illegal, it's something that's would be desecration. And again, part of the idea I think that Tippo Barnaby Lewis wanted to see was to try and convey to the public these more sacred or culturally sensitive aspects of these places, and begin to build an awareness among not just tribal members who might see these signs, but everyone who might read or see these signs, that these are places that need to be respected and taken care of. So that's kind of the sign in a nutshell. But you'll hear about the signage project again in the next presentation on Belle Butte, when we'll be as one of the recommendations for future work at Belle Butte is to create one of these signs for that location as well. And I'll pass it back to John. I don't know if there are any questions or comments.
I'll chime in. This is Commissioner Ball. I just love this sign. I learned something today. So I really appreciate the effort that went through certainly the team that put together the graphics, and also sort of bringing in multiple cultural histories here. I think it's just great. And the graphic removing all of the modern roadways is really, really helpful, I think, in just narrowing down to those things that people can get to that we understand ourselves. And I think it's a great touch point.
Great, thank you.
I totally agree. I have seen this before, but it's amazing. You guys did a really amazing job on this. And I too love that there's not just the song, but there's also that history, that Peeposh history. I think this is just going to be wonderful for Tempe. Thank you.
Thanks.
This is Commissioner Larson. I've got a couple questions. First, is there any significant to the shade of blue at the very top that forms the background of the Oidaba Doag and the pronunciation Tempe Butte there?
The blue, I think really with Stephen, we were appealing to the bluebird since the song is a bluebird song. So the idea of having the blue was that it was attractive, and I think he also was trying to have a more of a blue theme in this particular sign that would tie in with the bluebird. One of the things down the road, if this actually happens, is that it could work out that once we get more of these signs in place, that there may be some way of doing something in a more of an internet format or format where each sign is identified by a color scheme and almost like a tag or a glyph, so that if someone wanted to either click on a glyph or something like that, they could go and actually or try and visit all of the signs. This could be something that would provide people with a challenge to go see all the signs in all the different public places. So Oidabak Doak would be one of them, Vinam Doak. And Vinam Doak, that sign does have a different color scheme and kind of a different look to it, even though it's got that basic element of having a master map that locates it.
Yeah, and I love the map. I really do. I think it's great. I like the layout of it. I like that the roads have been removed. And it caused me, I will share that it caused me to really look at it and focus and see the different peaks and say, okay, wow, I can see what that, I know what, modern day we call that Camelback Mountain, and this is South Mountain because, I can see the word South Mountain on there. And the overall layout and the text and everything I think is great. I will say that one thing I found to be just a little bit confusing is in the legend, is a red dot says Museum Heritage Center, and then in parentheses under it says open to the public, which that's great. But then the blue dot says, I'm sorry, I'm not going to, Akamel Odoham Places, and there's no, this causes me to think, are these places not actually open to the public? And then I thought, well, you can hike up to the top of it, so I'm not sure. And then Papago Buttes, those are open, and so is Camelback Mountain. So that's the only thing I saw that, and I thought, I think that's open to the public, but it doesn't say that there. I like the encouragement to visit the museums because that's something that the general public may not particularly think of as an option or whatever to go and learn about it. But I did find the legend to be just slightly confusing. However, overall, I think it's just fantastic. I really like it.
Great. Yeah, that's a good comment. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, you'll notice that some of the areas, like for example, the down in the lower, I would say southwest corner, where it says Estrella Mountains, for example, that doesn't have a dot, and so there's some areas that we wanted to include traditional names, but that don't actually have a park you can go visit, even though there is Estrella Mountain Park. But the Estrella Mountains themselves are, mostly on the Gila River Indian community, so they aren't accessible. But I'll take a look at that caption and see if there's a way we can, make that a little bit less cumbersome and maybe a little bit more straightforward.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, even if it's just removing I read through all this and I can't remember if I saw something in the body of the text that said open to the public. I don't think that it did, but even if that parentheses open to the public is just removed, I think people generally, when they see the word museum, it's a place where people go to see things, right. and so therefore it should be open to the public. And any place you see museum, it's kind of by the word museum, people I think tend to be encouraged to go. It's a place to go and learn and see things and historical things, or whatever the nature of the museum might be. So maybe a solution is to simply remove that parentheses open to the public, and that would be it. Right. That's the only constructive criticism that I have about it. And I think it's great. I love the colors. I love the bright blue and in the background against the background. I think that's great. I love how the petroglyph pops. I love how the calendar stick pops. I think it's great.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's a great idea. I mean, in some ways, Museum Heritage Center, if it's not open to the public, what is it? So yeah, I don't think there's any loss by taking away open to the public. A museum, almost by definition is going to be open to the public. So that's a good suggestion.
But not during the pandemic, so maybe it is good to take it out.
Yeah, that's true.
When I do, Chair Buss, Commissioner Larson, thank you, Commissioner Larson, for that input. I think that is a very helpful suggestion. I do want to mention that we will be taking this to the Four Southern Tribes meeting next Friday. I think I neglected to mention that before, but I did want to inform the Commission that in addition to being developed in close partnership with Gila River and Salt River, we will be taking this draft to the Four Southern Tribes Cultural Resource Working Group meeting next Friday.
All right, thank you, John. Thank you, Mr. Darling.
Thank you.
Any comments on this? No? All right. Let's move on to item number 5. It's a beautiful presentation, by the way. Let's move on to item number 5, a presentation on Bellevue cultural resources. And do you have something to tell us first about it, John?
I do, yes. Thank you, Chair Buss. I'm trying to share once again, get back to the PowerPoint, but I'm guessing perhaps Craig and Andy will have their own, so I will just skip back there. This is tremendously exciting. The Commission will likely recall that probably a year ago now, plus or minus, there was to be work on the water tank atop Bellevue. Because it is a traditional cultural property, because there are, or were at the time, numerous archaeological sites. They've since been consolidated to one, but numerous at the time sites on the butte. Monitoring was recommended. So the city did bring on a monitor. They hired Logan Simpson for that work. During the course of that work, unfortunately, there was disturbance at the south, or the north end rather, of Bellevue that was not permitted, and unfortunately it was associated with city work, and so Logan Simpson was then brought on to complete a damage assessment, make recommendations, and complete mitigation work. So with that, I will turn it over to Craig and Andy so that they could present an overview of what that mitigation work entailed. And I will say it is tremendously exciting for those of you who are familiar with the Hemingway Expedition and the struggle to repatriate some of those items. I think you will see the value here. For those who are not, I'd be happy to share more offline about that particular situation, but this is very exciting. So Andy and Craig, please.
I believe Craig is going to start this off. So.
Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties, but now I'm unmuted. Yes, thank you. Like Andy, this is my first time at the commissioners at the Historic Preservation Commission meeting, so thank you for having me. It's good to see some familiar faces, names and faces as well. John, do you want me to share my PowerPoint, or do you have it ready and loaded?
Craig, if you'd be so kind to share, I know you said you're having some difficulties. I fear that if I pull up one additional file here, my computer may just implode.
Okay. Can you guys see it now, or?
Not yet.
All right. This is also a learning experience with WebEx. So let me.
Okay. But you're not in presenter mode. There we go. That's better.
There we go.
All right. Looks good.
Well, great. Yeah. Thanks, John, for the introduction. That kind of does lay some of the background and the groundwork for how this research and this project got started. And you'll have to also excuse me. I'm not as fluent as Dr. Darling is with the O'odham language, so I'm going to continually refer to Bell Butte in its English name as Bell Butte or as Batsholm, as it is also called. So just kind of start off with some recognition and acknowledgements. Thank you to the city of Tempe for sponsoring and guiding and serving in support of this project. It's been a pleasure working with the city on this. Also, a thanks to the TIPO office of the Salt River Maricopa Indian community, and also the Gila River Indian community for their assistance, their continued support and trust with this project. There were also a number of O'odham and Peeposh community members who shared their knowledge and memories and songs about Bell Butte or Batsholm with us. So for that, we are grateful as well. As John alluded to, this study was really part of a cultural resources damage assessment stemming from that it was a fiber optic line project. They were doing some ground disturbing work at the base of the butte and also laying some conduit up the slope of the butte. And Logan Simpson came out and was able to assess the area of ground disturbance at the base of the butte. And our assessment, we did not find any damages to previously undocumented subsurface cultural resources or features during that assessment. However, in working our way through that evaluation process, we also learned that we couldn't really provide a full assessment of the damages to the butte for two reasons. The first is that from an archaeological perspective, we really had an incomplete, incongruous understanding of the cultural resources on and around the butte. There were a number of overlapping polygons, various site records, a lot of institutions having their own records, not being shared across the board. There was also had never, despite all the archaeological attention that has been placed on this butte, there has never been a full, comprehensive, systematic survey of the butte to date. So we really didn't know what all was there. The second thing is we know that this place was important and significant to the O'odham and Peeposh communities, and primarily through the archaeological research and records that have shown that there is a ceremonial cave site on the east face of the butte. But we didn't know how this place was important or why it was important to the O'odham and Peeposh communities. So we really felt that the cultural resources damage assessment needed to be informed not only through a more comprehensive archaeological perspective, but also a tribal perspective as well. And this would be important because first, it would provide a better understanding about the cultural significance of the butte, which would inform the damage assessment. But two, once we grappled with how this place was significant in terms of its archaeological resources and its from a perspective of the tribe, would really help out the city with future planning and projects at the butte. And kind of a third goal that came out of this was that in talking and discussing the significance of the butte with the tribal communities, we really were able to have an opportunity to help preserve traditional memory culture at the butte, which is great for keeping kind of the traditions and stories alive. So those are kind of our three goals, and how we met those goals was these three tasks. First being the archival records review. We wanted to really dig into the records at Arizona State Museum, Pueblo Grande, the Tempe History Museum. It kind of makes sense of all these different projects and site records. The second was to conduct a comprehensive systematic survey of Belle Butte. As I mentioned before, that had never been done before. And just kind of small bits of information were hinted at in the archaeological records, but we knew there was going to be a lot more there. And the third component of this research was the ethnographic study with tribal community members. And I'll just say that for now, because Andy Darling is going to really take that part of the presentation in a little bit. So the first, component of this was the archival records review. Like John alluded to earlier, there's a number of sites that have been recorded or talked about or discussed atop the butte. The best known is the Ceremonial cave site. We'll get to that a little bit more. But we found in our review 13 other historic properties that had polygons on various institutional records in this area, and some of them overlapped. Some of them had the same names in different locations. And basically through some just a little bit of detective work, some archaeological work, we were able to get these down to 9 key properties, which in the end we consolidated into one. But these consist of the Ceremonial cave site. There's been 4 archaeological sites recorded on the slopes or atop the butte. And those include both prehistoric and historic artifact scatters. There's prehistoric canals that extend on all around to the north and south of the butte. We also have some historic period canals that are eligible for the National Register, and some historic cemeteries with Tempe double butte, twin buttes on either side of the mountain there. We also knew, based on records reviews, that there was going to be a number of petroglyphs and some bedrock mortars at the butte. They had been mentioned in archaeological records, but they had never been really systematically documented as to their locations and extent and numbers. So that was what we had in hand before we headed out to do the survey. We knew we were going to encounter some stuff. Just how much was the question? So as I already mentioned, the Ceremonial cave site is the better known or cultural resource at the butte. To kind of give you some more context about this part of the property, it was first visited first visited in terms of archaeology in the 1880s during the Hemingway Expedition. Frank Hamilton Cushing came and he completely excavated the contents of the cave site and took them back east to be curated and preserved. And he completely removed everything to the point where any archaeologist who tried to visit the cave site in the early 20th century basically said there was not a shred left of anything, not even a shirt or anything. And where this gets kind of starts to become a story that Andrew Darling will tell most of, is that in 1945, Emil Hallery analyzed all the contents recovered by Cushing as part of his synthesis of the Hemingway Expedition. And here's the key point. He concludes in his dissertation that all these objects from the Ceremonial cave site are not ancestral Otlam, but rather Puebloan in origin. And we're going to argue that is a very incorrect conclusion. And sadly today, all those objects are not with the Otlam or Peapox communities, but they are actually still being held by the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University in Massachusetts. So kind of skipping forward to our fieldwork component of this project, armed with this information about what has been done at the butte before, Logan Simpson's archaeologists went out and did a systematic survey of the butte. That survey resulted in the identification of 14 discrete features and a number of isolated artifacts scattered across the butte. The 14 features include, obviously, number one, the cave site. And we scoured that, every nook and cranny of that, looking for any contents. But as every archaeologist who's ever visited the cave in the last 100 years has noted, there's nothing there. Nothing's left in terms of material culture. We also found 11 petroglyph panels or locales where there were groups of petroglyphs. We found we identified a total of 32 individual petroglyph elements among those locales. We also found 2 areas of bedrock mortar clusters, or clusters of bedrock mortars, and you can see a couple of examples of that on this slide here. And Andy might even be able to elucidate on some of the tribal perspectives on these features as well. But the functional interpretation is this is where people would gather wild resources such as mesquite and kind of, you know, be positioned on the bedrock and grind some of these food stuff. We found the bottom right picture is a hammerstone. As I've mentioned, there's a number of petroglyphs atop the butte, and these hammerstones are, you know, always or most of the time associated with these petroglyph locations. They were used to help peck the patina and produce the petroglyph. It kind of gets to the petroglyphs. As I said, there's about 11 different locales or concentrations of panels. 32 individual elements were identified amongst these 11 panels. Most 27 of the 32 elements were found near the summit. Unfortunately, an unknown number may have been destroyed by the construction of the water tank atop Belle Butte in the 1960s. There are a few panels located at lower slopes, including 4 near the cave. Now, most of these petroglyphs are associated with the Gila Style, which was characteristic of the Hohokam cultural tradition and common from about 450 to 1450 AD minimally. It's about 2/3 of the petroglyphs were geometric designs, circles, spirals, motifs, and the like. 6 were anthropomorph figures and 2 were animals. There was one petroglyph that stood out though, and that's the one on the far right side of the screen. This was actually noted by Frank Midville when he first came to the Butte in the 1920s, and he even talked about in the 1930s. This is not a traditional Gila style petroglyph. And this is where I segue to Angie Darling to take over why this petroglyph is so unique. So Andy, I'll let you take it away. Yeah, I'll control the slides for you.
Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead on to the next slide, because we have another slide that talks a little bit about this unusual petroglyph. So we'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Craig. As Craig was mentioning, the significance of Bats Home or Belle Butte to the Alton Peeposh and Peeposhes is pretty great. It is again acknowledged by the 4 southern tribes and the Gila River and Salt River communities as a traditional cultural property, particularly for the significance of the ceremonial cave that's located there. But the position of the cave actually and its importance also extends to the Butte as a whole. So when we talk about the traditional names, they do refer to the cave, but they also refer to the Butte as well. And this is partly because of the presence of traditional cultural and significant features like the rock art, also the bedrock mortars, which are in O'odham are called chupa, or plural of it is chuchpa. The chuchpa are places that can receive offerings. Some ancient ancestral chupa are sometimes used as places that receive offerings. But also you find places like Belle Butte that have associations of grinding areas and rock art that are sometimes known as daidakut, or sitting places, or spiritual dwellings. And so these particular topographic features take on this particular spiritual quality. One of the important things about Bats Home is that the cave, and there are quite a few stories about the cave, but one that came up actually in the work that we were doing for the South Mountain Freeway in South Mountain as part of the traditional cultural property work there, is a story about an evil sorcerer who actually, or a witch, who receives become sort of lured into the dark side of the medicine world over in the west end of the Gila River Indian community. And he's found out after he causes a number of terrible things to happen, sicknesses and plagues, and the people of the Gila Crossing area, Kamatki area community, figure out who this evil sorcerer is. And he's generally referred to as a Saijukam, which is a particular type of sorcerer. They identify the Saijukam and chase him, go on a long distance chase, chasing him into various places. But he eventually ends up in the cave at Bat's home, where he disguises himself as a bat. And the way that they find him, he's not you have to wonder about just how creative this Saijukam was. He disguises himself as an albino bat, so he's a white bat among all these other bats living inside the cave. And they're able to identify him and then take him out and kill him, and eventually deposit his remains back at the shrine where he received the evil power over at South Mountain. Now, this was a fairly well-known story among the O'odham of the west end of the Gila River Indian community, but there are other stories that kind of go along with Bell Butte that I hadn't really looked into before, and then we were able to do this ethnographic study, which brought shed a whole new light not only on the contents of the cave, but the significance of the butte itself. And kind of to summarize some of the results of that study, the O'odham traditional name for Bell Butte is Nanakmort Key, which mean bats, plural. Nakmort is bat, so Bat's Key is bat's home. And the Pipash also, who are relatively latecomers to the area, they arrived in the late 18th century, and then also the Halshudom branch of the Pipash arriving in around the 1830s. They adopted the same reverence for Nanakmort Key or Bell Butte and gave it the name Kapanyak Niava. And Kapanyak Niava basically means place where bats live. So these are fairly generic names. Nanakmort Key could apply to any place that bats live, but when talking about the sacred place where known as Bat's home, this is kind of where the derivation comes from. Bat's home being the place where the evil Saijukam sorcerer hid himself and then eventually was discovered. I could only find one song related to Bell Butte, but this was something that Barnaby Lewis shared with us, and also it's been recorded by Canyon Records. So we actually have a publicly accessible version of the song for Bat's Home. And this is one of the songs that prior to the start of fieldwork, Barnaby graciously organized traditional religious activities to take place at sunrise. And in addition to offering prayers and blessings, the vice president of Salt River, Ricardo Leon, and Barnaby's son, Jared Lewis, also offered songs to the Butte, including Bat's Home song. And so we were able to provide a translation of the Bat's Home song, which talks about certain aspects of the Butte, but also the cave, in which you see the cave and you hear the sound of buzzing bees, and you go in, and if you go into the cave, you start to feel the effects of almost feeling drunk from the sound of the bees. And part of the story goes that the further you go into the cave, then you start to hear the sound of a reed flute playing, and ultimately the sounds of people singing. And basically the cave in the Butte as a power place has that effect, so that the person who is able to hear those sounds and is accessible to those spiritual powers may enter the cave. And the story goes, eventually that person will pass out essentially and dream and receive those spiritual powers for curing or other kinds of medicine. So that's the again, part of the cultural background of this cave as a traditional cultural place. And in talking to O'odham and Pipash elders, just because the cave's been emptied out doesn't make the place any less sacred, or in the case of Pipash elder that we talked to, any less dangerous. So this place is meant to be respected, and the idea of going into the cave is something that not Autumn or Peeposh would necessarily want to do, just for their own personal safety and spiritual safety. Next slide. So getting back to that petroglyph, what was interesting about this particular petroglyph is that there are a number of archaeologists in various studies of ancestral Autumn or Holcomb rock art felt that the practice of producing rock art is something that disappeared with the demise of the Holcomb culture. However, it's becoming more and more accessible, that there is rock art that does appear to have continued into the post-Holcomb era that may have been produced by, or likely was produced by, historic Autumn people. This particular petroglyph is interesting because it really doesn't conform much to Gila River styles, but it's the execution is very much in the style of traditional prehistoric rock art. And in talking with Craig and some of the archival research that he had done, Frank Midvale had actually recorded that when he visited the cave, he had recorded that the cave, which this piece of rock art is located just below the cave mouth itself, was identified to him by an Autumn as a god's house. And so this kind of triggered some ideas in my own mind of expressions in Autumn traditional culture about God's houses. And the only God's house that we really are most familiar with is what's known as the Suhuhu Key, or elder brother's home. And this is typically represented by the Autumn representation that we all know really well. And in looking at that, Craig and I were kind of going back and forth over this. What we realized is that the figure of that particular, probably more recent rock art really does approximate the central part of the Suhuhu Key, or Autumn maze. And so it seems very likely that in this case, the glyph for cave or key, being a god's home, may actually be what this particular petroglyph is representing. The absence of a maze is interesting, in part because elder brother's home is Suhuhu Key, or the maze, and one of elder brother's homes is South Mountain. So Bell Butte certainly wouldn't be elder brother's home, and so the god that lives here wouldn't have needed a maze to hide in. So the fact that we have this one partial element of the entire Suhuhu Key representation actually makes a lot of sense with respect to a possible petroglyph representing a key or cave or house, or God's house. So this is one of the things that we've presented it. I discussed it with Barnaby Lewis and some of the Autumn who we were working with, and they kind of said, yeah, that makes sense. So hopefully, I think this was something that was interesting to them, and may actually be something, as we, if someone were to pursue this further and looking at other representations in other places, that this may actually bear out in time. But this particular glyph is especially interesting, and given its location just below the mouth of the ceremonial cave, we feel pretty confident in at least proposing that interpretation as a hypothesis. Next slide.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any comments?
Chair Buss, I don't, excuse me, I don't believe they're done with the presentation yet.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Unless anyone has any questions about that particular petroglyph. But the other aspect of the ethnographic study, one of the efforts that's been ongoing for many years now, has been an attempt by the Salt River Indian community working with Gila River to secure the return of the collections, particularly the deceased ancestors and associated mortuary objects and objects of cultural patrimony from that were recovered by the Hemingway Expedition. The Hemingway Expedition was much more focused on large-scale excavations in the vicinity of Belle Butte at sites like Los Muertos and Los Guanacos, and an enormous amount of material was recovered. And all of that, all of those collections are currently at the Peabody Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This includes the objects from the ceremonial cave that Craig mentioned. About in 2013, Gila River and Salt River did go and visit the collections without the intention of actually looking at the objects from the ceremonial cave, but by chance they walked by the boxes and said, what's in those? We need to look at those. And so they had a very brief moment to be able to take photos of some of the objects from those excavations and verify that they were indeed there at the Peabody Museum. As part of this project, Gila River and Salt River agreed to share some of those photos with us. And while we had intended to include those photos in this presentation, they asked what we only show the old historic photos from Howery's 1945 work and not share those publicly. So we were able to refer to quite a few of the objects using photographs that came from the cave and begin to reevaluate some of the earlier interpretations that Howery made in 1945 in his publication, 1945 publication, about the ethnic affiliation, cultural affiliations of these objects from the cave. And as Craig mentioned, in general, what Howery concluded was very much consistent with the earlier observations of the Hemingway Expedition, which was searching for Zuni origins and tracking the Zuni from the Colorado River through the sites in the vicinity of in the Salt River Valley area, and then back to Zuni. So that the general bias that archaeologists had at the time were that many of these objects were going to be related to ancestral Pueblo origins. And in particular, this contributed to the development of the idea of the Salado migrations and Salado connections with the Hohokam, and generally ignored the local Akimoto O'odham or O'odham connections or ancestral O'odham connections that might have existed with the cave site and the surrounding sites in the valley. Unfortunately for Howery, this was his dissertation. This was work based on his dissertation, and he had access to important ethnographies that were done in 1908 and I think it was the 30s for the Peeposh. So so he kind of missed these connections, even though he cites these references. And what we found in going over his work, as well as the photographs that were provided with O'odham cultural experts, that nearly everything that Emo Howery identified as Puebloan could be matched up with an ancestral or O'odham analog, some of which are items that are still used today or were still used in the early 20th century. So these are some of the examples. Because we're working only from photographs, we really were limited to working from photos, but this does set the stage for eventually going back to the Peabody and organizing not only a repatriation claim, but then going back and reevaluating all the objects directly. But these will give you an idea of some of the objects that came from the ceremonial cave. The most common object and the excavation reports for the Hemingway Expedition identified as many as 1,600 what are known as watch or reed cigarettes. These are ceremonial smoking tubes that were recovered in 1888. Now, smoking tubes are very much a form of kind of cloud blower pipe that was made from cane, carrizo cane, and was filled with smoking materials that could include various forms of wild and domesticated tobacco, but there are a number of other different types of materials that were used for smoking, and these are things that are really kind of interesting and haven't been thoroughly studied. Watch smoking tubes were also typically left in caves, but they were also left on platform mound sites as offerings. And there are many stories about different deities and cultural heroes, as well as medicine people going into caves and smoking these offerings. And the story goes, if it doesn't kill you, if you survive the experience, that you'll come back with medicinal powers. So as many as 1,600 were recovered from the cave during the excavations in the 1880s. And Howery later reported, several hundred at the Peabody Museum. So there's a bit of a mystery there about where a lot of these cane cigarettes ended up. Now, one of the characteristic things about cane cigarettes is that they often are invested with textiles wrapped around them, and sometimes beads and other objects that are like small beads of turquoise or pendants are tied to them. And a lot of these textiles are still there at the Peabody Museum, and we were able to look at some of these in the more recent 2013 photographic record. Many of them have been separated from their cane cigarettes. So this may offer some insight into, they may have taken the textiles off and discarded the cigarettes as being redundant or something like that. So that's something that needs to be looked into. What's interesting about these textiles is that they are in some ways miniature representation of dance sashes that on full size would have been worn by different dancers, similar to the Pascola dancers. And in particular, there's an O'odham deity known as the Navichu that I'll talk about a little bit later, who wore dance sashes like this. And there are some potential associations of this Navichu deity with the cave at Nanangmort Key. Next slide. One of the other more common offerings are prayer stick offerings. Again, Howery, partly because of the times, prayer sticks were commonly associated with Puebloan ceremonies, but we know that prayer sticks are used by Navajos and used by O'odham. They're used by many cultures in the American Southwest. So just because they're prayer sticks doesn't make them Pueblo. And commonly at the time, anything that was considered a religious object was often called paho, which is paho is the Hopi word for prayer sticks. So anything that looked ceremonial oftentimes was called a paho by archaeologists who had just adopted that word to refer to those kinds of objects. Among the O'odham, the prayer sticks are known as omina, and they're also a very common feature of offerings on sites and in caves, but they're also commonly used as part of a famous or well-known ceremony called the Vigida. And the Vigida is a ceremony that involves the Navichu deity that I mentioned. There are a number of omina or prayer stick offerings that came from the cave. Some of them are quite simple, and the middle drawing is the drawing from Howery 1945 of some of these individual ones. Some of them do appear in bundles, and the photo to the left is examples of ethnographic omina, which were published by Russell in 1908 with the name omina. So Howery in 1945 would have had ready access to that kind of information. So, the fact that he was kind of in a way thinking Pueblo and not looking into the local tribal ethnography, this really kind of reveals a bias at the time. Some of the more famous omina are effigy prayer sticks, which you see to the right, and the decorations certainly appear to be very Southwestern in character. And again, this was something that Frank Hamilton Cushing and Emil Howery were more inclined to interpret these as Puebloan, simply because they were more familiar with Puebloan decorative styles. And yet, in talking to O'odham cultural experts, one in particular took one look at these and said, "Oh no, these are part of the Vigida O'odham ceremony." So this harvest ceremony, the Vigida, was something that these certainly could have been used in or for other functions. Next slide. In addition to the omina, what also came from that cave are a number of objects that, again, were readily identified as objects for curing. One of the curing deities is the Navichu spirit, who also participates in the Vigida ceremony and is a hunter figure. So having objects for curing in this cave are not out of the ordinary in terms of a cave of this type. The object on the left is from the cave, again, a drawing by Howery. We had a photo of this particular object, and this crook type object for curing. It's known as a yakta. The yakita are a particular type of curing object that's used by the Makai or the Mamakai for curing different kinds of diseases. The crook type is made to bring wind and clouds and would have been used in the Vigida ceremony. But the two drawings at the top are objects from the cave, one that is in the shape of a wing and the other which has a kind of a human form to it on the right. The one to the right, Howery and Cushing were very much inclined to interpret as a Kachina representation. However, in looking at these have the form of 20th century, early 20th century Yakita curing effigies. And so the photos at the bottom are examples from the American Museum of Natural History of actual O'odham curing effigies. And the one on the left, I believe, is a one that's used for butterfly sickness. The one in the middle is a representation of a horned toad or lizard and lizard sicknesses. It's used to treat that. And then the other one on the final, the third one on the right is one that's used to use fevers. I'm not sure exactly what it to cure fevers. I'm not sure what it actually represents. But these particular characteristic Yakita have a pointed end because they're pressed at the various locations on the patient's body during a curing ceremony. So these pointy ends are really very functional and are pretty characteristic. So when we showed these to O'odham cultural experts, there's really very little question as to what they would interpret them as being, as opposed to the more Puebloan association that Howery was more inclined to associate them with. Next slide. And this will be the final example of the material culture. Again, going back to the Peabody and doing an inventory would let us hope that there may be other things that we aren't really aware of. There were some objects of ceramics, a few ceramic pieces that were also probably used for curing and have direct correlates with O'odham curing activities. But one of the other objects that was interesting of wood from the cave were a number of ancestral O'odham arrows. What was interesting is that Howery at the time was kind of following the interpretation that O'odham didn't use compound arrows. The 3 out of 4 of these were compound arrows, which are arrows with a foreshaft and a main shaft. And the foreshaft is usually of some kind of hardened wood, or you may have a projectile point attached to the end. But for Howery, compound arrows were Puebloan versus O'odham arrows being simple arrows with no foreshaft. When you begin to look at this, there are actually 2 types of O'odham arrows, 2 main types. The hotport are arrows that were typically used for hunting, and hotport is used today to refer to any kind of arrow because arrows used for warfare went out in the 19th century and haven't been really made since then. However, when you look at historical dictionaries and accounts of O'odham arrows, they did use compound arrows for warfare, and these arrows had a particular name called uhu, and the uhu arrows were compound and were specifically used for warfare. They could be used for hunting, but they were identified as warfare arrows. And we actually have, from the Pennington Dictionary, the dictionary published by Pennington from the 18th century, actually identifies these 2 types of arrows quite clearly. So again, the general assumption that Pueblo culture was more sophisticated, more advanced than the O'odham, was generally used to suggest that compound arrows were Puebloan rather than O'odham. However, these actually make perfect sense, particularly if they were placed in the cave in the after the Hohokam, but before the arrival of the Hemingway Expedition during the period of time when Apache raiding and Yavapai raiding were the most fierce. It's not it's not surprising that we found they found compound arrows placed in the caves. What's also interesting about uhu, halpart is the name for arrows that's most commonly used today. Uhu is now used to refer to, is also used to refer to bullets or any kind of ordnance. And so you can imagine the name uhu has become referred to bullets in the same way that the foreshaft of a compound arrow would be essentially when you load your compound arrow, you're loading it with a foreshaft. And so the foreshaft has actually become the word for bullets like you would put in a gun. So, you know, the reanalysis and reconsideration of the material culture from the cave has really rather dramatically changed our current understanding of what the significance of the cave is and the material culture that's there. It also creates an enormous precedence for any kind of claim that Salt River and Gila River would want to make for the repatriation of these objects, since the use of the cave was undoubtedly ceremonial. Now, the last sort of thing that I wanted to share about this cave with you was that when we were doing the ethnographic work, because of the pandemic, not only was travel dramatically restricted for me, but we ended up, a lot of the conversations that I had with cultural experts ended up in many cases to be back and forth text messages about photos. It was easier for them to be texting messages back and forth. And one particular autumn cultural expert shared his summary of what he was thinking about with this cave. And that's the quote to the right of this slide that says, "This cave was an important part of ceremony, very sacred. The sticks, which are the omina, are used with the navichu." And the navichu is depicted to the left, two representations. One is the navichu dancer dressed in the navichu costume, and then to the right is a drawing of what the navichu deity looks like. And as he says, the sticks are used with the navichu. The small effigies are also his. The place is very old, very powerful. And so in his estimation, after looking at all the photos and looking at the images from Howry's dissertation, that this cave is very probably a storehouse for the navichu objects for the ceremonies. And the navichu ceremony, at the end of the ceremony, typically the various sacred objects were taken and stored in caves in the four directions, with the exception of the mask that you see being worn, which was owned by the navichu impersonator, who then passed that mask down to his son. And this cultural expert commented, you know, everything's there except the navichu's mask. But this actually makes very good sense because it shouldn't be there. It would have been at the navichu impersonator's house. So the fact that everything's there that it could be associated with a navichu without his mask actually is very consistent with the traditional storage practices of navichu sacred objects. And this includes, you can't really tell from this photo, but the arrow that that particular navichu impersonator is using or holding is a compound arrow. So again, the finding compound arrows in the cave is also consistent with navichu tradition and spirituality. So again, this really opened our eyes in ways that I had not expected. I knew the story of the evil sorcerer that was found in the cave and hid in the cave as a bat, but these other deeper historical connections and associations with the cave and its contents are something that really was quite remarkable from the study and in some ways very much unexpected. So this was an amazing outcome. And I think we're ready for our last slide. So Craig, did you want to run through these, or should I? Or
we can handle them, tag team it a bit. I guess I could just start with the upfront goal for the city of Tempe was really to create this better understanding of the cultural resources and historic properties of Belle Butte to assist with city planning and other preservation scenarios. And how we got through to that was through doing that archival research and the field survey. And as we discussed, we took about 13 or more different site areas with polygons and condensed them, brought them down. But in the end, we thought it was best just to encapsulate what is still standing of Belle Butte. You know, it's been hit pretty good on all fronts from ADOT and other development projects. But just to make it a single site in terms of the archaeological record, and that helped. It also reflected better the significance of the Butte to the tribal community. So instead of having 3 or 4 different polygons up there, it just more accurately reflected the significance of the Butte in its entirety as an archaeological resource, and also a place of important ceremonial or traditional value to the Native American communities of the area. Andy, you want to go with the next one?
I've kind of already touched on that. Just that these ethnographic investigations reveal a direct descendant affiliation of the Akimot and longstanding historical connections of Peeposh with Nonamort The Navichu connection is really fascinating, both from a scholarly as well as a traditional cultural aspect. The cave does face to the east, and the Navichu in the traditional histories of the O'odham, after the fall of the great houses, goes to the east and resides in the east. And so the connections of this east-facing cave with the sunrise and with the Navichu is something that I don't think that has been really appreciated in previously, but is something that I know the Tohono Nation is trying to revive the Vigida harvest ceremonies that involve the Navichu. And so this recognition is something I think that will have great interest to all 4 of the Southern tribes and will really perpetuate the importance of Belle Butte in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. And some other things that Andy and I and even John Southard have discussed of how to kind of get this important place more recognized is to have a formal nomination of Bats Home to the National Register of Historic Places, as well as a formal recognition of the O'odham places through the U.S. Board of Geographic Names. Some other things that we would like that we're recommending, and I think would really serve all communities' interest, would to facilitate traditional religious activities. We had one before at Bats Home before we conducted the field work at the request of the Salt River and Gila River TIPO offices, and it was powerful and moving, and to continue to facilitate those practices at the Butte, I think would be a good thing. We touched upon the public signage. Andy, similar to something that he presented earlier for Tempe Butte, maybe have something developed here. For those who haven't been to Bats Home or Belle Butte in a while, unfortunately, it has kind of been this. It's not being well maintained. It's covered in graffiti. There's trash all over the place. It's kind of disheartening to see. And one of the big things is the big white T, that's painted on the Butte right next to the cave. And Andy, do you want to say something about what that symbolizes?
Well, just with the presence of the T there, obviously it's very inconsistent with the cave itself, and certainly is a dramatic conflict with the rock art that actually identifies the cave as a god's house, and certainly detracts from and is something that can be removed to help restore the integrity and setting of the place. These are sorts of things that, as we look forward to things like building of high rises, protecting the exposure of the eastern face of Belle Butte to the sunrise, is another thing that is worth considering. I think I wasn't there, but I believe Craig experienced this at the cave, that when the sun does rise, the cave fills with light, and this is a fairly important aspect of its sacredness and the natural setting.
Thanks, Andy. And one of the big things that we've kind of reiterated the point here is that these objects of tribal patrimony that I think Andy presents a very compelling case, and with the information from the community members from the O'odham and Peeposh communities, that these objects don't belong at the Peabody Museum. So if there was a way we could facilitate with the city, a way to help promote the repatriation of the cave contents, I think that's be a big step forward. And then the final point with the question mark is the land ownership initiative. And this is where Annie and I will kind of stop presenting our presentation, kind of hand this back to John Southard if he has anything else to add. But we will also, of course, entertain any questions and comments.
Well, thank you. Craig, you leave me with the easy one. I appreciate it. No.
I don't know if this is the right venue for this, but that's your decision.
Yeah, well, just to a lot of the suggestions that are made, recommendations, of course, will require the consent of and participation of the landowner. It seems that there's a widespread assumption that Tempe owns Tempe does not own Belle Butte. Maricopa County owns a portion of the Butte. We actually lease that space for a water tank and communications equipment. It seems the remainder of the Butte and the immediately surrounding property is likely owned by ADOT. At one point, the off-ramp for the Broadway Road exit actually ran east of Belle Butte. That's why that area is so heavily disturbed. As best as I can tell, it looks as if ADOT still owns that area. Whether or not ADOT knows that they own it is, it seems, an open question. But land ownership is certainly something that would need to be addressed should some of these recommendations be implemented.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I talked a great deal about the research into the archaeological records, but the amount of research we've put forward towards figuring out who actually owns this land is an impressive endeavor in its own right.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Craig and Andy. Are there any questions?
I just have a comment. I really enjoyed reading that report. I thought it was fantastic.
Thanks.
Great job, guys. I had to show it to our curator at Pueblo Grande, who was really very interested because of, the cultural affiliation studies that she's working on. So yeah, this is really a great report. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, well, thank you very much. We will move on, I guess, then to item 6, more park Ramada improvements.
Thank you, Chair Buss, and thank you to Craig and Andy. We were so incredibly fortunate to have the two of them on that project with their knowledge, their experience, their connections, their ability to work so closely with Gila River and Salt River. This is just a terrific work product. This is something that has a great deal of value. It's very meaningful. So I'd really like to express a very heartfelt thanks to them for their work. There was a lot of passion put into that work. Moving on to item 6, the Moore Park improvements. Craig Hayton of Parks and Recreation will be speaking to this. Moore Park is located north of the river. It is east of Mill Avenue and both north and south of Curry Road. The portion of the park being discussed this evening is the portion south of Curry Road. There are WPA, Works Progress Administration structures in both the north and south portions of the park. The WPA structures are listed in the Tempe Historic Property Register. the Tempe Historic or the WPA structures were also submitted for National Register listing. It was assumed up until fairly recently, very recently rather, that the WPA structures and the WPA structures alone were the contributing elements as relates to the National Register nomination. It seems that the steel rail ramadas atop the hill on the south portion of the park and one steel rail ramada at the lower elevation in the south portion, in addition to the concrete staircase and some other items, are in fact listed as contributing features in the National Register nomination. I suspect, and perhaps Commissioner Nucci or Commissioner Garrison could speak to this, I suspect that that was perhaps at the suggestion of the HSRC as the nomination was being processed. Nonetheless, that's the background. So of course, alterations to the Tempe Historic Property Register listed features require review and approval by the HPC. This is not, that is not being sought tonight. They are much earlier in the process, but they do want to share where they are with the group and receive any input that you may have. And Commissioner Garrison, were you raising your hand? If not, I will.
Fine.
Oh, sorry.
I'm fine.
Okay, thank you. Well, with that, I will turn it over to Craig Hayton of City of Tempe Parks and Recreation.
Thanks, John, and good evening, Commissioner members. Really appreciate the opportunity. It has been great to present previously on different Parks and Recreation related items. I'm joined by Erin Kirkpatrick, who is our Capital Improvement Project Coordinator. She'll be leading the majority of this presentation. John did a fantastic job introducing what we will be running through. I will be sharing a PDF, and we do really want to make sure that throughout this process, not only are we engaging with the Historic Preservation Commission, but we also recognize that Moore Park also sits partially on the Papago Preserve area too. So this is an opportunity for us not just to engage with the Historic Preservation Commission, but also with the newly formed Desert Conservation Commission. And we have a wonderful relationship with both, and we really value and appreciate your time. So I will share the presentation and then turn it over to Erin.
Thanks, Craig. I'm going to share my my video for just a minute, and then hopefully sign that piece up so you guys have a better quality experience. I'm Erin Kirkpatrick. I have been our Parks Capital Improvement Project Coordinator for the past year. Prior to that, I worked in neighborhood services. This is my first presentation to your group, and it's nice to see all of you and recognize many of the names. This is also probably just my third official presentation in this capacity, so bear with me. But we are just in this intro phase of our Moore Park Improvement Project, and I would like to take the time to just mention briefly before I begin that this presentation was created and these concepts were created prior to us quite understanding the historical significance of the steel ramadas and the concrete stairs in the park. So we are tonight definitely seeking your advice and your input on some of the conceptual renderings we've come up with to this point. So with that, I will stop my video and talk to our slides. So next slide. Basically tonight, I'm just going to go briefly over the park location, a little bit of the background and history we based our project scope off, and some of the initial concepts we've come up with in partnership with Aztec, who is our engineering designer for this project. John has been in the design process with us for this entire history up till now, so it's been really helpful to have his engagement and his support. We'll go through a brief timeline of outreach that we're hoping to do in the next couple weeks, and then I'll open it up for questions. Next slide. So as Craig mentioned, Moore Park sits just over the Mill Avenue Bridge. at Mill and Curry. The park is bisected by Curry Road, and the part that we're focusing on is that southern section, which itself is sort of half in the preserve and half out. The park has historic ramadas both on the lawn area and the sort of the space that lies outside of the preserve, and then also on the hilltop, which are adjacent to a parking lot. Next slide. The background and the history we're working with when we began this design process was mostly focused on the WPA structures. So there are stone ramadas, raised planter beds, stone benches and tables that are all within the park. Those were built from 1936 to 1938 when people were stopping there to picnic, often on their way through Tempe. And as John mentioned, any changes to these structures will require your approval. Next slide. We're using an SRPMIC grant to do most of the design work for this project, as well as a bit of the restoration. We're also funding part of the project through our general CIP. We hope to restore the historic lower ramadas, as well as potentially restore or replace the upper ramadas, depending on what the guidance is. Other notable improvements we hope to make are just additional accessibility. Whenever we touch a park, we try to bring it into compliance and create some ADA access. So you'll see that in our conceptual plans. We would be shoring up the hillside and shoring up those historic planter boxes and retaining walls, as well as adding site lighting, walkway lighting, and new site furnishings. Next slide. These are just a few pictures of those WPA ramadas. And we do have some initial plans from Aztec and how they would go about the restoration work, but it would be consistent with all best practices, standards, and guidelines. Does anyone have any questions on this? I didn't include a lot of specific information, but basically they will be removing the corrosion on those roofs, which actually are not the original roof, but they would be removing the corrosion there, replacing the grout, doing some masonry replacement, hopefully with stone that's already on site, repairing damaged stone, and then reconfiguring the electric that is currently in those ramadas. Next slide. All right, I know this is going to be hard to see, but so far we have been moving forward with the background information that it would have been okay to remove and replace the hilltop ramadas. And part of that is due to some initial scoping in which those structures were sort of investigated. And Aztec had some real questions as to whether they were structurally sound enough to proceed with a restoration or an adjustment. I don't know if anyone has been there, but they're very low hanging in the gabled roofs, and they're fabricated of railroad ties and corrugated steel, which is not in the best of condition. So our initial approach was to consider removing and replacing them with a structure that would still call to those elements and materials, but would be modernized and accessible. So that's kind of what these plans are pointing towards. And then they're a little bit different in both the size of ramada that is being proposed to replace the hilltop ramadas, and they're also a little bit different in orientation. Option A also moves the current staircase, which also could be problematic, to the south to create a seamless entry from the parking lot through the ramadas down to the lower section of the park. Option B has the staircase remaining in the same general area and moves the walkways south from there. The gray line that you see toward the east and south of the plan is our new accessible, ADA accessible sidewalk that would make a connection from the parking lot all the way down through the park onto Mill Avenue. And if you've had a chance to look over this presentation already, I'm not sure if you have, if there's any questions you have about those options, I'm happy to answer those as well.
I had a question of clarification. This is Commissioner Ball. John, could you speak to, once again, the question of the railroad ties as specifically being listed as part of the critical elements of the National Register listing? Is that railroad ties in the original WPA era structures at the lawn area down below, or is that in reference to the railroad ties incorporated into the upper structures?
Excuse me, Chair Buss, Vice Chair Ball, the rails, the steel rail ramadas, there are 4 up top and 1 in the lower elevation. They were constructed in the 1950s. After looking through the National Register documentation, I did some additional research and I found that they were attributed to a gentleman, the last name of Van Horn. They were actually touted as a innovative design in the sense that the steel rails would be very difficult to damage. They were unlikely to be compromised, at least at any point in the near-term future. And the roofing material at the time was palm thatch. So should it be blown away or set aflame or otherwise damaged, could be easily replaced. So those features do date to the 1950s, 1952, if I recall correctly. And they are indeed contributing features to the National Register listing.
Okay. That does present certain challenges to replacement.
Yes, it does. And we became privy to that information just the end of late last week. So we will be adjusting, based on your recommendations for sure. Next slide, Craig. So should we consider a replacement of those tilt-top ramadas? These are the conceptual renderings that Aztec has come up with for those. They would all be, for the most part, steel fabricated. Option C has a stone veneer around the column and steel roofing. All have corrugated steel roofs and would incorporate those stone elements as well. So we've got a single slanted roof, a cantilevered, and a dual slanted roof. And basically occupying the same sites as the existing ramadas with a little bit of changes to their orientation. Currently the ramadas line up, north to south, and these would be a little bit on an axis, depending on which concept was moved forward. Next slide. So our goal, has been a fairly rapid design process. We do have a virtual public meeting, informational meeting scheduled for next Tuesday at noon, and an online survey that would be open for the next 2 weeks following. We will be in the design process into the summer, and then we hope to begin restoration and construction in the early part of 2022. So, hopefully a year and a bit from now. And I am open to your questions and comments and expertise. Thank you.
I had a couple of additional thoughts. I think the pathway, the slope required for your accessible path between the upper parking lot and the lower area thankfully moves itself pretty much out of the way of the primary setting behind the WPA structures. So that's a good thing. The proposed modification to the original WPA era stair is going to be pretty seriously problematic. Certainly doesn't prevent the potential for another means of accessing the lower lawn area from parking, but the removal of that, as well as the ramadas up top, should only be considered if they are deemed to be irreparable. And I think even then it will be problematic to make a significant change to the organization of the site with the stair.
And Chair Buss, Vice Chair Ball, if I may real quick, I just, I'd like to note the stairs are in fact contributing, they are a contributing feature. They too date to the 1950s as opposed to the 1930s, just for clarification.
Thanks, John. If additional ramadas are considered on the site, I think the least impact, as viewed from the traditional point of use, the lower area of the site where the original materials were placed, is probably a guiding viewpoint that should be considered, and the least impact to that original viewpoint and setting would probably be in order as you're making design decisions.
Thanks, Commissioner Ball. I agree with what you're saying, to try to keep it as original as possible. Is the plan to replace the railroad ties with railroad ties again, or some kind of cut lumber?
If we were to renovate the ramadas on the hilltop,
Right.
I think we have asked that steel and the railroad ties themselves or something very similar would be used in that design process. I think if our approach were to change to restoration, they would continue to be the material of choice.
Okay, so possibly railroad ties again, or at the very least, some kind of lumber, maybe a rough sawn lumber, something that looks close to a railroad tie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are steel ties right now that are there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm just, excuse me while I take notes. I want to make sure I capture everything.
This is Commissioner Garrison.
Go ahead.
I agree with Commissioner Ball's approach. I think the 50s ramadas, you can look at them as either a restoration or a rehabilitation if you really need to change them a little bit, or leave one intact and representative of the others, and only impact what you need to impact, following a preservation of the entire site. But I think the treatment should be rehabilitation.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner Garrison. Was there anyone else that had any thoughts?
Yeah, this is Commissioner Garrity. I just wanted to ask, is there any, I'm not sure what the extent of ground disturbance, but I imagine they'll have to be excavating some kind of foundations. Is there any discussion of archaeological monitoring? Because this area, okay, good. Because I think it's within a site, and even if it's not, it's like a stone's throw from Loma del Rio.
Yeah, it's very close, and it's obviously, being right on the river as it was. We have anticipated that the entire project would have to be monitored.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
All right. Did anyone else have some input?
This is Commissioner Garrison again. John, do you think the nomination should not focus on the individual features, but should work toward a district nomination?
Potentially, I don't know what the HRC or HSRC would be receptive to. It's listed under A at the local level. I think a district is certainly worth looking at.
That could solve some of the treatment options. Wouldn't be so restricted that it's not the Ramada that's the feature, it's the Ramada setting.
Yeah, I think as far as I could tell, the real challenge there would be processing that. I don't know what their timeline is. As I understand it, they're looking to move relatively quickly. And I think while that is worth exploring, I don't know that the time that would be required to prepare that, submit it, send it to the HSRC, and the keeper would be feasible.
Oh.
But it is a good idea. Thank you, Commissioner Garrison.
That would remove the individual structures from their contributing status, just that there were Ramadas in that location.
It's a bit more nuanced. Districts still have contributors, but it may provide some additional flexibility. Looking at revising, the nomination, someone would prepare it. It would be submitted to the State Historic Preservation Office. They would then agendize it with the Historic Sites Review Committee. Right now, we're meeting 3 times a year. And then, assuming that the HSRC passes it on to the keeper of the National Register, it would then receive consideration there. It's worth considering. There is a potential that it would not pan out as desired, and there would be a fair amount of time that was expended on the effort. But we could discuss it more offline, certainly.
Okay. Yeah, and I think recognizing this information, we are happy to just take everything under advisement. Right now, we are not, gung ho to take out those Ramadas, but we are looking to get them more accessible and make them more available for use.
Sure.
Thank you all.
All right. Well, thank you for the presentation. And
no problem.
all right. Is that all you had on this, John?
Chair Buss, yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And we'll move on to agenda item number 7, Historic Preservation Plan Priorities.
Well, at this point, I won't attempt to pull up the PowerPoint lest something go wrong. It's the same introduction that I provided to the Commission last month. This is a follow-up opportunity. I'd asked last month that if anyone have thoughts, comments, suggestions, priorities, what have you, that they share them at this meeting. This will not be the final opportunity, of course. I suspect that this will be agendized for the Commission meeting next month. There will also be the first public meeting at the end of next month. So there will be many additional opportunities to discuss things, but certainly if anyone has anything they'd like to share, anything they'd like to suggest, please put it on the table.
So, Commissioner Ball, I have nothing to add beyond last month's discussion points.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that? No? All right, John, I guess we'll keep rolling with what we had from the previous meeting. And
Okay.
we want to move on to agenda item 8, chair and staff reports.
Well, Chair Buss, the fence panels that were designed by Jacob Butler are still, it seems, well, I guess no, I take it back. They're not being fabricated. They are now complete, to my understanding. It's now a matter of coordinating their installation. It is hoped that that will occur in the very near future. Planning for the 2021 Historic Preservation Conference, slated for Tempe, continues. It has been moved. It will not occur in June. It is now slated for October. I think in the interest of time, we'll limit it to that. There's nothing pressing that comes to mind, aside from the fact that the subcommittee regarding the First Congregational Church did meet prior to this meeting. They directed staff to initiate conversations with the development team, conversations related to mitigation options, looking at creative mitigation, essentially exploring all possibilities. So that is a discussion that will be initiated.
All right, thanks, John. And what do you have for us under our final agenda item number 9, current events, announcements, or future agenda items?
Chair Buss, I have nothing.
All right. Do any of the commissioners have anything there? No. All right. I guess that's about it then. So we will call this meeting of the February 10th, 2021 Historic Preservation meeting concluded, and the time is 8:13.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.